The rain fell steadily against the windows of the psychiatric ward at Bergallsli Hospital in Zurich, where a young doctor named Carl Gustav Jung sat across from patients whose minds had fractured under pressures that others seemed to navigate with ease. It was 1900, and Jung was beginning to notice patterns that would eventually reshape our understanding of human psychology. Some individuals, when faced with the same traumatic experiences that destroyed others, emerged not just intact but transformed into something more powerful than they had been before. What Jung observed in those early years would later crystallize into one of psychology's most profound insights: extraordinary minds are not born extraordinary. They are forged through a process of deliberate self-destruction and reconstruction that most people are too afraid to undertake. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has already faced the ultimate destroyer, himself, and emerged victorious. The paradox of strength through surrender. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations that the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Jung would later understand this ancient wisdom through the lens of analytical psychology, recognizing that the very experiences most people flee from are precisely those that create extraordinary minds. The key lies not in avoiding destruction, but in choosing which self to sacrifice. Consider the case of a brilliant software engineer who worked for a prestigious technology company in Silicon Valley. Saracen had climbed every ladder, exceeded every expectation, and built her identity around being the person who never failed. Her colleagues respected her technical brilliance, her managers praised her reliability, and her family took pride in her success. Yet beneath this perfectly constructed exterior, Sarah felt hollow, disconnected from any deeper sense of purpose or authentic self-expression. The weak self that Sarah had constructed was magnificent in its effectiveness but brittle in its foundation. It was built on external validation, fear of failure, and the constant need to prove her worth through achievement. This self had served her well for years, but it was also a prison that prevented her from accessing her true creative potential. Jung understood that every individual contains multiple selves: the persona we present to the world, the shadow we hide from others, the anima or animus representing our unconscious opposite, and the deeper self that represents our authentic nature. The weak self is typically the persona, the carefully constructed mask we wear to gain social approval and avoid rejection. While this persona serves important functions, it becomes problematic when we mistake it for our true identity. The extraordinary mind recognizes that the persona, no matter how successful, is ultimately a limitation. It requires constant maintenance, restricts authentic expression, and creates a fundamental disconnection between who we appear to be and who we actually are. More importantly, it makes us vulnerable to external forces because our sense of worth depends on maintaining an image that others control through their approval or disapproval. Sarah's moment of recognition came during a company restructuring that eliminated her position despite her excellent performance. In that instant, she realized that the self she had spent decades building could be destroyed by forces completely outside her control. The secure identity she had cultivated was revealed to be an illusion, dependent on circumstances she could not guarantee. This realization marked the beginning of what Jung called the dark night of the soul, a period of psychological dissolution that precedes genuine transformation. For most people, such experiences represent pure loss, something to be avoided at all costs. For the extraordinary mind, they represent opportunity, the chance to destroy the weak self voluntarily before external forces destroy it involuntarily. The architecture of psychological transformation. Jung's concept of individuation describes the process by which an individual integrates the various aspects of their personality into a cohesive, authentic whole. This process inevitably requires confronting and integrating what he called the shadow, those aspects of ourselves that we have repressed or denied because they conflict with our idealized self-image. The weak self is characterized by its inability to face the shadow. It maintains its coherence by projecting unwanted qualities onto others, denying uncomfortable truths about its own nature, and avoiding situations that might reveal its limitations. This creates what Jung termed psychological inflation, an artificially inflated sense of self that is fundamentally unstable because it is based on partial information. The extraordinary mind, by contrast, develops what Jung called psychological differentiation, the ability to distinguish between what belongs to the self and what belongs to others, between what is authentic and what is performative, between what serves growth and what serves ego protection. This differentiation requires a kind of psychological courage that most people cannot summon because it demands facing the very aspects of themselves they have spent years avoiding. When Sarah lost her position, she had a choice. She could focus on external factors, the unfairness of the decision, the incompetence of management, the unpredictability of corporate life, and attempt to rebuild the same kind of persona at another company. This is what most people do, and it is why they remain vulnerable to the same kinds of destruction. Or she could use this crisis as an opportunity to examine the foundations of her identity and rebuild them on more solid ground. Sarah chose the more difficult path. She began to explore the aspects of herself that her professional persona had suppressed: her creativity, her desire for meaningful work, her need for authentic relationships, her spiritual longings. This exploration was initially destabilizing because it revealed how much of her life had been constructed around avoiding these deeper aspects of her nature. Jung observed that this kind of psychological exploration inevitably brings up what he called compensatory material: thoughts, feelings, and impulses that balance out the one-sided development of the conscious personality. For someone like Sarah, who had developed an extremely rational, achievement-oriented persona, this compensatory material might include emotional sensitivity, artistic impulses, or spiritual yearnings that had been suppressed in service of professional success. The weak self experiences this compensatory material as threatening because it challenges the carefully maintained image of who one is supposed to be. The extraordinary mind recognizes it as essential information about who one actually is. This recognition requires what Jung called moral courage, the willingness to be authentically oneself even when that authenticity conflicts with social expectations or personal fears. The alchemy of adversity. Jung was deeply influenced by alchemical texts, which he interpreted not as primitive chemistry but as symbolic descriptions of psychological transformation. The alchemical process of turning base metals into gold provided him with a metaphor for how human consciousness could transform suffering into wisdom, weakness into strength, and dissolution into integration. The alchemical concept of nigredo, or blackening, describes the initial stage of transformation where the original material must be broken down completely before it can be reconstituted in a higher form. Jung saw this process as analogous to the psychological breakdown that precedes genuine growth. The weak self must undergo its own nigredo, a period of dissolution where its familiar structures collapse and its fundamental assumptions are called into question. Most people experience this breakdown as purely negative and expend enormous energy trying to prevent or escape it. They seek therapy to feel better, not to become different. They want to return to their previous level of functioning as quickly as possible. They view their suffering as evidence that something has gone wrong rather than as evidence that something is trying to go right. The extraordinary mind approaches adversity with what Jung called religious attitude, not necessarily connected to organized religion, but representing a fundamental orientation toward mystery, meaning, and transformation. This attitude recognizes that psychological breakdown often precedes psychological breakthrough, that symptoms may be attempts at self-healing rather than evidence of pathology, and that the goal is not to return to a previous state but to evolve into a new one. Sarah's period of unemployment extended longer than she had anticipated. Despite her excellent qualifications, she found herself strangely unable to generate enthusiasm for the same kinds of positions she had held before. What she initially interpreted as depression or lack of motivation, she gradually began to recognize as her psyche's wisdom, a refusal to rebuild the same structures that had already proven inadequate. During this period, she began to notice aspects of herself that had been dormant for years. She rediscovered her love of writing, which she had abandoned in college when it seemed impractical. She found herself drawn to volunteer work with underprivileged children, despite having no previous interest in education or social service. She began to pay attention to her dreams, which had become unusually vivid and seemed to contain important messages about her life direction. Jung would have recognized these developments as signs of the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism through which unconscious contents become integrated into conscious awareness. This function operates through symbols, dreams, fantasies, and seemingly irrational impulses that point toward a more complete expression of the personality. The weak self dismisses such experiences as distractions or self-indulgence. It wants to get back to real life as quickly as possible. The extraordinary mind recognizes them as expressions of the real life that has been waiting to emerge, a life more closely aligned with the individual's authentic nature and deeper purposes. The warrior's paradox. Jung's understanding of psychological transformation was deeply influenced by his study of Eastern philosophy, particularly the concept of Wu Wei from Taoism, the idea of effortless action that comes from perfect alignment with natural forces rather than struggle against them. He recognized that true strength often manifests as a kind of yielding, and that the most powerful individuals are often those who have learned to work with rather than against the fundamental forces of their own nature. This creates what we might call the warrior's paradox. The strongest people are often those who appear most vulnerable, because they have learned to derive power from authenticity rather than from armor. They have destroyed the false self that required constant defense and discovered the true self that is inherently indestructible. Consider the case of a corporate executive who had built his career on the image of invulnerability. James Morrison prided himself on never showing weakness, never admitting mistakes, and never allowing others to see him as anything less than completely competent and in control. This image had served him well in the competitive world of business, but it had also isolated him from authentic relationships and cut him off from important sources of feedback and growth. James's moment of reckoning came when his teenage son attempted suicide. In the hospital waiting room, faced with the possibility that his child might die while he had been too busy maintaining his image to notice his son's pain, James experienced what Jung called an antiadromia, the transformation of something into its opposite. His carefully maintained strength revealed itself as profound weakness, his success as failure, his control as helplessness. The weak self in James wanted to handle this crisis the way it handled everything else, by taking charge, finding solutions, and maintaining the appearance of having everything under control. But the magnitude of the situation made this approach obviously inadequate. His son's pain was not a business problem that could be solved through strategic thinking and decisive action. It required something James had spent decades avoiding: genuine emotional presence and authentic vulnerability. Jung observed that such crises often serve as what he called compensation for one-sided psychological development. When an individual has developed certain aspects of their personality to an extreme degree while neglecting others, life has a way of forcing attention to the neglected areas. The executive who has developed his thinking function while ignoring his feeling function will eventually be confronted with situations that cannot be resolved through thinking alone. James's journey toward destroying his weak self began with the recognition that his son needed not a powerful father but a real one. This meant learning to be present with uncertainty, to express emotions he had long suppressed, and to admit the limitations of his understanding and control. It meant discovering that true strength sometimes looks like acknowledging weakness, that real leadership sometimes requires following, and that genuine success sometimes demands accepting failure. The integration of opposites. One of Jung's most important insights was that psychological health requires the integration of opposites rather than the dominance of one pole over another. The weak self typically identifies with one side of a polarity: strength over weakness, thinking over feeling, masculine over feminine, conscious over unconscious, and attempts to eliminate or suppress the other side. This creates what Jung called psychological inflation in the identified aspect and possession by the rejected aspect. The extraordinary mind learns to hold paradox without resolution, to embody contradictory qualities simultaneously, and to access the full spectrum of human experience as appropriate to each situation. This requires what Jung termed the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to bridge conscious and unconscious, rational and irrational, individual and collective. Sarah's transformation involved learning to integrate her highly developed rational intelligence with her previously suppressed creative intuition. Rather than seeing these as contradictory forces competing for dominance, she began to understand them as complementary aspects of a more complete intelligence. Her analytical skills could serve her creativity by helping her understand market needs and develop sustainable business models. Her creative insights could serve her analytical work by revealing innovative solutions and previously unconsidered possibilities. This integration manifested practically when Sarah decided to start her own company focused on developing educational technology for underprivileged communities. This venture required both the technical expertise she had developed in her corporate career and the creative vision that had emerged during her period of unemployment. More importantly, it aligned her work with values that had been suppressed by her achievement-oriented persona: her desire to make a meaningful contribution, her care for social justice, and her need for authentic self-expression. James's integration involved learning to balance his natural leadership abilities with genuine humility and emotional intelligence. Rather than seeing vulnerability as weakness, he began to understand it as a source of connection and authenticity that actually enhanced his leadership effectiveness. His willingness to admit mistakes and uncertainty created psychological safety for his team members, enabling them to take creative risks and share important information they had previously hidden to protect themselves from his perfectionism. Jung recognized that this kind of integration cannot be achieved through willpower or intellectual understanding alone. It requires what he called active imagination, a technique for dialoguing with unconscious contents as if they were independent personalities with their own perspectives and wisdom. This process allows individuals to develop relationships with rejected aspects of themselves rather than simply trying to eliminate or control them. The birth of the authentic self. The destruction of the weak self is not an end in itself but a necessary precondition for the emergence of what Jung called the self with a capital S, the archetypal image of wholeness that represents the individual's full potential. This self is not created through the destruction process but revealed by it, like a sculpture that emerges as the artist removes unnecessary stone. Jung observed that the authentic self possesses qualities that seem paradoxical from the perspective of ordinary consciousness. It is simultaneously individual and universal, personal and transpersonal, finite and infinite. It does not derive its strength from opposition to others but from alignment with what Jung called the collective unconscious, the deeper layer of psyche that contains the accumulated wisdom and experience of humanity. This alignment creates what Jung termed numinous experience, encounters with meaning and purpose that transcend personal ego concerns. Individuals who have successfully destroyed their weak selves often report a sense of being connected to something larger than themselves, of serving purposes they do not fully understand but nonetheless feel called to fulfill. Sarah discovered this numinous quality when she realized that her educational technology company was not just a personal project but part of a larger movement toward democratizing access to high-quality education. She found herself working with an energy and dedication that went beyond personal ambition or financial motivation. The work felt meaningful not because it served her ego needs but because it served something larger than her ego. James experienced similar transformation when he began to understand his role as a father not just as personal responsibility but as participation in the archetypal pattern of nurturing and guiding the next generation. His relationship with his son became a vehicle for healing not only their individual relationship but also the generational patterns of emotional unavailability that had been passed down through his family. Jung recognized that this transpersonal dimension of psychological development distinguishes genuine transformation from mere ego enhancement. The weak self seeks to become a bigger, better, more successful version of what it already is. The authentic self seeks to become a clearer, more complete expression of what it has always been in potential. The invulnerability of authenticity, the extraordinary mind that emerges from this process of self-destruction and reconstruction, possesses a quality of invulnerability that is qualitatively different from the defensive armor of the weak self. This invulnerability comes not from being impenetrable but from being permeable, not from avoiding destruction but from having already been destroyed and rebuilt on foundations that cannot be shaken by external forces. Jung observed that individuals who have completed this process of individuation develop what he called psychological objectivity, the ability to observe their own thoughts, emotions, and reactions without being identified with them. This objectivity creates a kind of inner space that remains calm and clear regardless of external circumstances. They can experience intense emotions without being overwhelmed by them, face severe challenges without losing their center, and receive criticism or praise without having their sense of self-worth fundamentally altered. This quality of consciousness allows extraordinary minds to respond to situations from a place of choice rather than compulsion. They are not driven by unconscious fears, unresolved traumas, or unexamined assumptions. They can access the full range of human responses: aggression when boundaries need to be set, tenderness when healing is needed, determination when obstacles must be overcome, flexibility when adaptation is required, without being trapped in any single pattern of reaction. Sarah found that her new company faced numerous challenges that would have devastated her in her previous state of consciousness. Funding fell through, key employees left, competitors emerged with similar products. But, because her identity was no longer dependent on external success, these setbacks did not threaten her fundamental sense of self. She could evaluate each situation objectively, learn from failures, adjust strategies, and persist through difficulties without the emotional turmoil that had characterized her earlier relationship with professional challenges. James discovered that his transformation affected not only his personal relationships but also his professional effectiveness. His willingness to acknowledge uncertainty and seek input from others created more collaborative and innovative team dynamics. His ability to remain calm under pressure and maintain perspective during crises made him more rather than less effective as a leader. Paradoxically, his acceptance of vulnerability made him more rather than less powerful. Jung understood that this kind of authentic power is ultimately unassailable because it does not depend on maintaining any particular image or outcome. It comes from being aligned with what is true rather than what is wished for, what is real rather than what is imagined, what serves the whole rather than what serves only the ego. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has already faced the ultimate destroyer, the truth about himself, and emerged intact. He has discovered that his essence cannot be touched by external circumstances, that his value does not depend on others' opinions, and that his purpose transcends personal success or failure. He has found the eye of the hurricane, the still point around which all the chaos of life revolves but which remains eternally calm and clear. This is the secret of extraordinary minds. They succeed not because they are stronger than others, but because they have learned to derive their strength from sources that cannot be threatened by external forces. They have discovered the indestructible core of authentic selfhood that exists in every human being but is accessed only by those willing to undertake the perilous journey of destroying everything that is not truly themselves. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood in her laboratory at 3 a.m, surrounded by failed experiments and crumpled research papers, facing the most significant crisis of her scientific career. For 15 years, she had built her reputation on methodical, incremental progress in neuroscience research. Her colleagues respected her reliability, her grants were consistently funded, and her publications followed predictable patterns of modest but solid advancement. Yet here she was, confronting evidence that challenged everything she thought she knew about consciousness and brain function. The data before her suggested possibilities that mainstream neuroscience would dismiss as impossible. Her carefully conducted experiments indicated that consciousness might not be produced by the brain but rather received by it, like a radio tuning into a signal rather than generating music. This finding threatened not only her professional credibility but the entire worldview on which she had built her identity as a scientist. Jung would have recognized Elena's situation as a classic encounter with what he called the shadow, those aspects of reality that our conscious minds reject because they threaten our established sense of order and identity. For most people, such encounters result in denial, rationalization, or the dismissal of uncomfortable evidence. For extraordinary minds, they represent opportunities for expansion and transformation. The shadow as gateway to truth. Jung's concept of the shadow encompasses more than personal psychological material that has been repressed or denied. It also includes what he called the cultural shadow, collective assumptions, beliefs, and paradigms that society has agreed to ignore or suppress because they threaten established power structures or cherished illusions. Extraordinary minds distinguish themselves by their willingness to explore these cultural shadows, often discovering truths that others are too frightened or conditioned to perceive. Elena's dilemma represented a confrontation with the cultural shadow of scientific materialism, the assumption that consciousness is merely an emergent property of complex neural networks. This assumption had served as the foundation for decades of research and countless careers, including her own. Questioning it meant questioning not just a scientific theory but an entire way of understanding reality that her professional community had invested enormous energy and resources in maintaining. The weak self in Elena wanted to dismiss her findings, design new experiments that would produce more acceptable results, or find ways to interpret the data that fit within established paradigms. This response would have preserved her professional standing and maintained the comfortable certainty of her worldview. But it would also have required her to betray the very principles of honest inquiry that had originally drawn her to science. Jung observed that such moments of choice are crucial in the development of consciousness. When we encounter information that challenges our fundamental assumptions about reality, we can either expand our understanding to accommodate new evidence or contract our awareness to exclude threatening data. The first choice leads to growth and authentic development, the second leads to psychological rigidity and increasing disconnection from truth. Elena chose expansion. She began to explore research that she had previously dismissed as fringe or unscientific: studies of near-death experiences, investigations of psychic phenomena, examinations of consciousness during clinical death. What she found was not the collection of delusional thinking she had expected, but careful, methodical research conducted by credible scientists who had also encountered evidence that challenged materialistic assumptions about consciousness. This exploration required Elena to confront not only the limitations of her scientific training but also the psychological investment she had in seeing herself as a rational, objective researcher. She had to acknowledge that her previous dismissal of certain lines of inquiry had been based not on careful evaluation but on unconscious biases and professional conditioning. She had to face the shadow of her own closed-mindedness disguised as scientific rigor. Jung understood that this kind of shadow work, the honest examination of our rejected and denied aspects, is essential for psychological development. It requires what he called moral courage, the willingness to face truths about ourselves and our world that may be uncomfortable, inconvenient, or threatening to our established sense of identity. The collective unconscious and innovation. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious suggests that individual consciousness is connected to a deeper layer of psyche that contains the accumulated experience and wisdom of humanity. Extraordinary minds often distinguish themselves by their ability to access this deeper layer and bring forth innovations, insights, and solutions that seem to come from beyond their personal knowledge and experience. Elena's breakthrough came not through logical deduction but through what Jung would have called active imagination, a state of consciousness in which the barriers between conscious and unconscious, individual and collective, begin to dissolve. During a meditation session designed to clear her mind after weeks of intensive research, she experienced what she later described as a download, a sudden influx of understanding about the nature of consciousness that seemed to come from a source beyond her individual thinking. This experience provided her with a theoretical framework that could accommodate both her experimental findings and the established facts of neuroscience. She began to understand the brain not as the source of consciousness but as a sophisticated interface between individual awareness and a larger field of consciousness that transcends individual minds. This model could explain both the correlation between brain states and conscious experience and the anomalous phenomena that materialistic neuroscience could not account for. Jung would have recognized Elena's experience as an example of what he called the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism through which new understanding emerges from the synthesis of conscious and unconscious contents. This function operates not through linear reasoning but through intuitive leaps that connect previously unrelated information into novel patterns of understanding. The weak self is typically unable to access this transcendent function because it is too invested in maintaining existing patterns of thought and identity. It fears the dissolution of familiar mental structures that active imagination requires. The extraordinary mind learns to navigate these dissolving states with confidence, understanding that temporary confusion and disorientation are often necessary precursors to higher levels of understanding. Elena's willingness to enter such states and trust the insights that emerged from them allowed her to develop a revolutionary approach to neuroscience research. She began designing experiments that tested not just the mechanistic functions of the brain but its capacity to interact with non-local aspects of consciousness. Her work began to bridge the gap between rigorous scientific methodology and the investigation of phenomena that mainstream science had long considered beyond its scope. The alchemy of professional transformation. Jung's study of alchemy provided him with a symbolic language for describing psychological transformation processes. The alchemical stage of albedo, or whitening, follows the dissolution of nigredo and represents the emergence of purified consciousness that can perceive truth more clearly than before. This stage is characterized by increased discrimination, enhanced intuition, and the ability to see through illusions that previously seemed solid and real. Elena's research began to attract attention from both supporters and critics. Traditional neuroscientists dismissed her work as unscientific, while researchers investigating consciousness phenomena hailed her as a pioneer. She found herself in the uncomfortable position of belonging fully to neither camp, forced to navigate between rigid materialism and uncritical mysticism while maintaining her commitment to rigorous scientific methodology. This position of creative tension is characteristic of extraordinary minds during periods of significant breakthrough. They often find themselves isolated from their previous peer groups while not yet fully accepted by new communities of understanding. This isolation can be deeply challenging, but it also provides the psychological space necessary for genuine innovation. Jung recognized that original thinking often requires what he called holding the tension of opposites, the ability to maintain awareness of contradictory perspectives without prematurely resolving them into a false synthesis. This capacity allows new possibilities to emerge that transcend the limitations of either extreme position. Elena learned to hold the tension between scientific rigor and openness to phenomena that science had not yet learned to measure. She developed experimental protocols that applied traditional scientific methodology to non-traditional research questions. She created mathematical models that described consciousness-brain interactions without requiring either materialistic reductionism or mystical explanation. This approach required her to destroy the weak self that needed to be either a conventional scientist or a mystical researcher. Instead, she became something new, a scientist willing to investigate reality wherever the evidence led, regardless of whether her findings fit within established paradigms. This transformation was not without cost. She lost funding from traditional sources, faced criticism from former colleagues, and had to rebuild her professional identity from scratch. But the cost of remaining trapped in outdated paradigms would have been far greater. Elena recognized that the future of neuroscience research lay not in defending established assumptions but in developing new methodologies capable of investigating the full spectrum of consciousness phenomena. Her willingness to destroy her weak professional self positioned her to become a pioneer in a new era of consciousness research. The warrior's code of truth. Military strategists have long recognized that victory often goes not to the strongest force but to the most adaptable one, the army that can change tactics, learn from defeats, and innovate under pressure. Extraordinary minds apply this same principle to psychological and intellectual warfare, understanding that rigid adherence to established patterns of thought and behavior is a form of weakness that can be exploited by changing circumstances. Consider the case of Captain Marcus Rivera, a military officer whose unit was ambushed in a remote region where conventional tactics were ineffective. His training had prepared him for traditional warfare scenarios, but the situation he faced required approaches that his military education had not covered. The enemy used unconventional tactics, the terrain was unfamiliar, and his communication with headquarters was compromised. Marcus's weak self wanted to follow standard protocols, maintain the appearance of being in control, and avoid admitting that his training was inadequate for the current situation. This approach would have preserved his ego but likely resulted in mission failure and potential loss of life. Instead, Marcus chose to acknowledge the limitations of his preparation and seek input from unconventional sources. He consulted with local tribal leaders who understood the terrain and the enemy's cultural patterns. He incorporated guerrilla tactics that he had studied but never practiced. He empowered his subordinates to make decisions that normally would have required his approval. Most importantly, he accepted that success in this situation required him to become a different kind of leader than he had been trained to be. Jung would have recognized Marcus's approach as an example of what he called psychological flexibility, the ability to access different aspects of personality as situations require rather than being trapped in a single, fixed pattern of response. This flexibility comes not from having no center but from having a center that is strong enough to allow for adaptation without loss of essential identity. Marcus's unit not only survived the ambush but completed their mission more effectively than would have been possible using conventional approaches. The experience transformed his understanding of leadership, warfare, and his own capabilities. He realized that his greatest strength as an officer lay not in his knowledge of established procedures but in his ability to adapt, learn, and innovate under pressure. This transformation continued to serve Marcus throughout his career. He became known for his ability to handle unusual situations, to work effectively with diverse teams, and to develop creative solutions to complex problems. His willingness to destroy the weak self that needed to appear competent and in control at all times had revealed the strong self that could actually be competent and in control when necessary. The integration of wisdom traditions. Jung's psychological theories were deeply influenced by his study of Eastern philosophy, alchemy, Gnosticism, and other wisdom traditions that mainstream Western psychology had largely ignored. He recognized that these traditions contained sophisticated understandings of consciousness and human development that could inform modern psychological practice, even if their symbolic languages and cultural contexts differed from contemporary scientific approaches. Elena's breakthrough in consciousness research was facilitated by her willingness to explore similar territory. She began studying meditation traditions that had been investigating the nature of consciousness for thousands of years, quantum physics theories that suggested reality might be far stranger than classical science assumed, and anthropological research on healing practices that achieved results mainstream medicine could not explain. This integration required her to develop what Jung called cognitive humility, the recognition that her scientific training, while valuable, represented only one approach to understanding reality. She had to acknowledge that other traditions might possess knowledge that Western science had not yet discovered or validated. This acknowledgement required the destruction of the weak self that derived its identity from intellectual superiority and cultural chauvinism. Jung understood that genuine wisdom often emerges from the synthesis of seemingly incompatible approaches to truth. He called this synthesis the transcendent function and recognized it as one of the most important psychological capacities for navigating complexity and uncertainty. This function allows individuals to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without being trapped by any single viewpoint. Elena's research began to demonstrate this synthetic capacity. She developed experimental protocols that combine traditional neuroscience methods with contemplative practices derived from meditation traditions. She created theoretical models that integrated insights from quantum physics with observations from clinical psychology. She established research partnerships with traditional healers while maintaining rigorous scientific standards for evaluating their methods. This integrative approach yielded insights that would have been impossible from any single perspective. Elena discovered that certain meditation practices could be correlated with specific changes in brain function, that quantum coherence effects might play a role in consciousness phenomena, and that traditional healing methods often worked through mechanisms that Western science was only beginning to understand. Her work began to establish a new field of research that she called integral neuroscience, an approach that honored both scientific rigor and wisdom traditions while transcending the limitations of either approach alone. This synthesis required the destruction of academic boundaries, disciplinary prejudices, and cultural assumptions that had kept different approaches to understanding consciousness artificially separated. The emergence of authentic authority. One of the most significant characteristics of extraordinary minds is their development of what Jung called authentic authority, a form of influence that comes not from position, credentials, or external validation but from alignment with truth and genuine competence. This authority is immediately recognizable and naturally compelling because it is based on actual understanding rather than the appearance of understanding. Marcus discovered this principle when he returned from his unconventional mission and was assigned to train other officers in adaptive leadership. His superiors expected him to teach the standard curricula, but Marcus found that the real lessons he had learned could not be conveyed through traditional military education methods. Instead, he developed training programs that emphasized psychological flexibility, cultural intelligence, and innovative problem-solving. Initially, his approaches met with resistance from both superiors and subordinates. Military culture values predictability, hierarchy, and adherence to established procedures. Marcus's emphasis on adaptation and innovation seemed to threaten these values. But, as officers trained in his methods began to demonstrate superior performance in complex situations, resistance gave way to recognition. Marcus's authentic authority came not from his rank or position but from his demonstrated ability to prepare others for the kind of challenges that conventional training could not address. His willingness to acknowledge the limitations of traditional approaches and explore new possibilities had revealed capabilities that others could recognize and benefit from. Jung observed that authentic authority differs fundamentally from conventional authority in its source and effects. Conventional authority depends on external structures of power and must be maintained through control and coercion. Authentic authority emerges from internal alignment with truth and principles, and it naturally inspires respect and cooperation without requiring force. Elena experienced similar transformation as her consciousness research gained recognition. Traditional academic authorities initially dismissed her work, but researchers, clinicians, and funding organizations began to take notice as her findings were replicated and her theoretical models proved useful for understanding previously inexplicable phenomena. Her authority in the field came not from her institutional affiliations or publication record but from her demonstrated ability to ask the right questions, design meaningful experiments, and develop theoretical frameworks that advanced understanding. She had become what Jung called a cultural creative, someone who contributes to the evolution of human knowledge and understanding through their willingness to explore beyond established boundaries. The indestructible core, the ultimate goal of Jung's individuation process, is the discovery of what he called the self, the archetypal center of personality that represents the individual's full potential and authentic nature. This self is distinguished from the ego in that it encompasses both conscious and unconscious aspects of personality and is aligned with transpersonal purposes that transcend personal desires and fears. Individuals who have accessed this deeper center of identity possess a quality of presence and effectiveness that seems to come from beyond their personal capabilities. They can face challenges that would overwhelm others, maintain clarity in situations that confuse most people, and persist through difficulties that would cause others to abandon their goals. This capacity comes not from special talents or superior training but from alignment with sources of strength that are available to everyone but accessed by few. Elena's consciousness research led her to experience firsthand the phenomena she was studying. Through meditation practices and experimental protocols, she began to have direct experiences of consciousness that seemed to extend beyond the boundaries of her individual brain. These experiences provided her not only with research data but with a transformed understanding of her own nature and capabilities. She discovered that the sense of being a separate individual trapped inside a physical body was itself a kind of illusion, useful for certain purposes but not ultimately true. Her actual nature seemed to be more like a temporary focal point in a larger field of consciousness, connected to sources of intelligence and creativity that transcended her personal knowledge and experience. This recognition transformed her relationship to both success and failure in her research. When experiments failed or theories proved inadequate, she no longer experienced these setbacks as personal defeats. Instead, she understood them as part of a larger process of discovery in which she was participating but which was not dependent on her individual success or competence. Marcus made similar discoveries through his military service. His most challenging missions had taught him that his effectiveness as a leader came not from his personal strength or intelligence but from his ability to connect with and channel collective resources, the wisdom of his team, the support of allies, the guidance of mentors, and even what he came to think of as the strategic intelligence of the situation itself. He learned to approach complex missions not as problems to be solved through individual effort but as systems to be understood and worked with collaboratively. This approach required him to transcend the ego-driven need to be the hero or the expert and instead become what Jung would have called a servant of the self, someone whose personal will is aligned with larger purposes and patterns. This alignment provided Marcus with access to capabilities that seemed to come from beyond his individual training and experience. In crisis situations, he found himself knowing things he had not learned, making decisions that proved wise despite being based on incomplete information, and inspiring others to perform beyond their apparent limitations. Both Elena and Marcus had discovered what Jung called the indestructible core of personality, the aspect of self that cannot be threatened by external circumstances because it is connected to sources of strength and wisdom that transcend individual existence. This core provides the foundation for the kind of invulnerability that characterizes extraordinary minds, not the brittle invulnerability of ego armor, but the flexible invulnerability of authentic connection to truth and purpose. The man who destroys his weak self and discovers this indestructible core can never be destroyed by others because his true source of strength lies beyond their reach. He has found the eye of the hurricane, the still point of authentic selfhood that remains calm and clear regardless of external storms. This is the secret of extraordinary minds. They succeed not because they are stronger than others, but because they have learned to derive their strength from sources that cannot be threatened by external forces. The monastery bell echoed across the Swiss Alps as Carl Jung climbed the stone steps to his study at Bollingen Tower, the retreat he had built with his own hands during the most turbulent period of his life. It was 1920, and Jung was emerging from what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, a 6-year period of psychological crisis that had nearly destroyed his sanity but had ultimately revealed the deepest principles of human transformation. During those years, Jung had experienced visions, heard voices, and encountered psychological phenomena that mainstream psychiatry would have classified as psychotic symptoms. Yet rather than fleeing from these experiences or attempting to suppress them through medication or denial, Jung had chosen to engage with them directly, to learn from them, and to integrate their insights into a revolutionary understanding of human consciousness. This choice had cost him dearly. Colleagues questioned his sanity, his reputation in academic psychiatry suffered, and his comfortable identity as a successful doctor and researcher was shattered. But, from the ashes of his professional persona had emerged something far more valuable, a direct understanding of the transformative processes he would spend the rest of his life helping others navigate. Jung's personal journey through psychological dissolution and reconstruction provided him with the experiential foundation for his theory of individuation. He had discovered through lived experience that the destruction of the weak self is not an abstract psychological concept but a real process that can be consciously undertaken by those with sufficient courage and wisdom. More importantly, he had proven that this process leads not to annihilation but to the emergence of a more authentic and powerful way of being. The technology of transformation. Jung's confrontation with the unconscious taught him that psychological transformation follows discoverable principles and can be facilitated through specific practices and approaches. He developed what he called active imagination, a technique for consciously engaging with unconscious contents, and refined methods for interpreting dreams, analyzing symbols, and integrating shadow material. These tools constituted a kind of technology for consciousness development that could be taught to others. Dr. Michael Chen, a successful cardiac surgeon, first encountered Jung's ideas during a period of professional burnout that had left him questioning the meaning of his medical career. Despite achieving everything he had worked toward, prestigious position, financial security, professional recognition, Michael felt empty and disconnected from any sense of purpose beyond technical competence. The weak self that Michael had constructed around surgical excellence was beginning to crack under the pressure of constant performance demands and the emotional toll of dealing with life and death situations. He had developed what Jung would have recognized as a compensatory neurosis. His over-identification with rational, technical thinking was being balanced by unconscious eruptions of anxiety, depression, and existential questioning. Traditional approaches to dealing with professional burnout typically focus on stress management, work-life balance, and cognitive behavioral interventions designed to help individuals cope more effectively with existing circumstances. Jung's approach was fundamentally different. Rather than helping people adapt to unsatisfactory conditions, he provided tools for transforming the underlying psychological structures that create those conditions. Michael began practicing active imagination during his off hours, entering meditative states where he could dialogue with the parts of himself that his surgical persona had suppressed. He discovered a creative, spiritual aspect of his nature that had been dormant since childhood, when he had wanted to become an artist before being redirected toward more practical pursuits by family expectations and cultural pressures. Through this dialogue process, Michael began to understand that his burnout was not simply the result of overwork but a symptom of soul starvation. His technical competence as a surgeon had developed at the expense of other aspects of his personality that also required expression and integration. His unconscious was essentially on strike, refusing to continue supporting a life path that ignored so much of his authentic nature. Jung had observed that such psychological strikes often occur when individuals have developed too far in one direction without adequate compensation from other aspects of their personality. The psyche has a natural tendency toward balance and wholeness, and it will create symptoms and crises to force attention to neglected areas of development. Michael's active imagination sessions revealed not only what was missing from his life but also how he might begin to integrate those missing elements. He began to see that surgery itself could become a form of artistic expression when approached with the right consciousness. The precision, creativity, and life-serving intention required for excellent surgery were not fundamentally different from the qualities that great artists bring to their work. This realization allowed Michael to transform his relationship to his profession rather than abandoning it. He began to approach each surgery as a creative challenge requiring not just technical skill but intuitive understanding, aesthetic sensibility, and spiritual presence. His work became a form of meditation, a practice of presence that connected him with deeper sources of meaning and purpose. The emergence of authentic power. Jung's understanding of psychological transformation was deeply influenced by his study of religious and mystical traditions that described similar processes of death and rebirth. He recognized that what these traditions called spiritual awakening and what psychology called individuation were essentially the same process: the dissolution of false identity and the emergence of authentic selfhood. This process inevitably involves what mystics have called the dark night of the soul and what Jung termed the confrontation with the shadow. During this phase, individuals must face aspects of themselves and their world that they have spent years avoiding.
This confrontation is inherently destabilizing because it challenges fundamental assumptions about identity, reality, and meaning.
Lisa Rodriguez, a highly successful marketing executive, entered this phase when her company was acquired and her position eliminated despite her excellent performance. At 42, she faced the possibility of starting over in a career that no longer felt meaningful to her. The identity she had built around professional achievement was suddenly irrelevant, and she was forced to confront the question of who she was beyond her job title and accomplishments. The weak self in Lisa wanted to immediately find another position that would restore her previous sense of identity and security. But something deeper resisted this approach. The acquisition had created an opportunity to examine whether her career path was truly aligned with her authentic values and interests, or whether it had simply been the result of societal expectations and fear-based decision-making. Using Jung's approach to shadow work, Lisa began to explore the aspects of herself that her professional persona had suppressed. She discovered a passionate commitment to social justice that had been dormant since her college years, when she had considered becoming a civil rights lawyer before choosing marketing because it seemed more financially secure. She also confronted the shadow of her achievement addiction, the way she had used professional success to avoid dealing with deeper questions about meaning, relationship, and spiritual purpose. Her identity as a successful executive had provided a comfortable distraction from the existential uncertainty that she now had to face directly. Jung understood that this kind of confrontation with suppressed material is essential for psychological development. The shadow contains not only negative qualities that we have rejected but also positive potentials that we have failed to develop. Often, the very qualities that could most enhance our lives are hidden in the shadow because we have been taught to see them as inappropriate, impractical, or dangerous. Lisa's shadow work revealed not only her passion for social justice but also her natural abilities as a teacher, mentor, and community organizer. These qualities had been expressed only in limited ways during her corporate career, usually through volunteer work that she treated as secondary to her real job. The process of integrating these shadow qualities required Lisa to destroy the weak self that derived its worth from external validation and financial achievement. This was genuinely frightening because it meant releasing the identity structures that had provided security and recognition for decades. But it also opened the possibility of living from a more authentic and fulfilling foundation. Lisa eventually started a consulting firm that helped organizations implement socially responsible marketing practices. This work allowed her to integrate her professional skills with her deeper values, creating a career path that felt like an expression of her authentic nature rather than a betrayal of it. The transformation required her to accept significantly less financial compensation in the short term, but it provided rewards, meaningful work, authentic relationships, and spiritual fulfillment that money could not purchase. The collective dimension of transformation. Jung recognized that individual psychological transformation is intimately connected to collective cultural evolution. Individuals who complete the process of individuation often find themselves serving as bridges between old and new paradigms, helping others navigate similar transformations and contributing to broader cultural shifts toward greater consciousness and authenticity. This collective dimension of transformation became evident in the work of Dr. Ahmed Hassan, a psychiatrist who had been trained in conventional medical approaches to mental illness but had become increasingly frustrated with the limitations of purely pharmaceutical interventions. His patients often experienced symptom relief from medications but rarely achieved the kind of genuine healing and personal growth that led to lasting fulfillment and resilience. Ahmed's confrontation with the limitations of his professional training led him to explore alternative approaches to mental health, including Jung's analytical psychology, somatic therapies, meditation practices, and traditional healing methods from various cultures. This exploration required him to question not only his individual methods but the entire paradigm of mental health care that he had been trained to uphold. The weak self in Ahmed wanted to maintain his standing in the psychiatric community by continuing to practice conventional approaches while perhaps adding some complementary methods that would not threaten his professional credibility. But his experiences with patients who required more than medication could provide made this approach feel increasingly dishonest and ineffective. Using Jung's concept of the transcendent function, Ahmed began to develop what he called integral psychiatry, an approach that combined the best insights from medical science with psychological, spiritual, and somatic approaches to healing. This integration required him to become a different kind of doctor than he had been trained to be, one who saw symptoms as meaningful communications from the psyche rather than simply as problems to be suppressed. Ahmed's transformed approach to psychiatry began to produce results that surprised both him and his patients. Individuals who had been struggling with depression, anxiety, and other psychological difficulties for years began to experience not just symptom relief but genuine personal growth and increased life satisfaction. His waiting room filled with patients who had been referred by others who had experienced this deeper kind of healing. But Ahmed's success also created challenges. Colleagues questioned his methods, insurance companies balked at covering his longer sessions and unconventional approaches, and regulatory bodies scrutinized his practices. He found himself having to choose between conforming to established medical standards and continuing to develop approaches that actually helped his patients achieve lasting transformation. Jung would have recognized Ahmed's situation as an example of what he called cultural individuation, the process by which individuals who have completed their own psychological development begin to serve as catalysts for broader social and cultural transformation. Such individuals often find themselves in positions of creative tension, serving as bridges between old and new ways of understanding reality. Ahmed chose to continue developing his integral approach despite professional pressures. He began training other therapists in his methods, writing about his approaches, and establishing treatment centers that could provide the kind of comprehensive care that he had discovered was necessary for genuine healing. His individual transformation had evolved into a contribution to the transformation of mental health care itself. The wisdom of uncertainty. One of the most paradoxical aspects of Jung's approach to psychological development is its emphasis on embracing uncertainty rather than seeking security. The weak self is fundamentally motivated by the desire to feel safe, certain, and in control. The authentic self that emerges through individuation is characterized by comfort with mystery, change, and the unknown. Captain Elena Vasquez discovered this principle during a peacekeeping mission in a region torn by ethnic conflicts that had persisted for generations. Traditional military approaches to such situations focused on establishing control, maintaining order, and enforcing predetermined rules of engagement. But Elena found that these approaches often exacerbated tensions rather than resolving them. The situation she faced was too complex and dynamic for rigid protocols. Each day brought new challenges that required innovative responses. Different ethnic groups had conflicting needs and perspectives that could not be reconciled through conventional negotiation methods. The political dynamics shifted constantly as various factions gained or lost influence. Elena's weak self wanted to impose order through superior firepower and strict adherence to military procedures. This approach would have been simpler and more familiar, but it also would have been ineffective and potentially counterproductive in the cultural context she was working within. Instead, Elena chose to embrace what Jung called negative capability, the ability to remain uncertain and doubt-filled rather than irritably reaching after fact and reason. She began spending time with representatives from all factions, listening to their concerns without immediately trying to solve their problems or impose solutions. This approach required Elena to destroy the weak self that needed to appear competent and in control at all times. She had to acknowledge that she did not understand the cultural dynamics she was working with and that her military training had not prepared her for the kind of leadership the situation required. Through this process of acknowledging uncertainty, Elena began to develop what Jung called participatory consciousness, a way of understanding situations from within rather than from the outside. She started to see the conflict not as a problem to be solved but as a living system to be understood and worked with collaboratively. Elena's unit began to achieve results that surprised their superiors. Rather than simply maintaining an uneasy peace through the threat of force, they facilitated genuine dialogue between conflicting groups and helped establish sustainable agreements that addressed underlying causes of tension rather than just symptoms. Her success came not from applying predetermined solutions but from creating conditions where the various parties could discover solutions that worked for their specific circumstances. This required a kind of leadership that was more midwifery than management, helping to birth solutions that were already trying to emerge rather than imposing solutions from outside. The eternal return. Jung's study of religious and mythological traditions revealed a universal pattern that he called the eternal return, the cyclical process of death and rebirth that characterizes both individual development and cultural evolution. This pattern suggests that transformation is not a one-time achievement but an ongoing process that deepens and expands throughout life. Individuals who have successfully destroyed their weak selves and emerged into authentic selfhood often discover that this transformation is just the beginning of a lifelong journey of development. The principles they have learned through their initial breakthrough must be applied repeatedly as they encounter new challenges, assume greater responsibilities, and face the changing demands of different life stages.
Dr.
Sarah Chen, whose story began in part 1 with her transition from corporate employment to social entrepreneurship, found that her educational technology company required her to continue destroying and rebuilding aspects of herself as it grew and evolved. The qualities that had made her successful as a startup founder were different from those required to lead a larger organization, which were different again from those needed to expand internationally and work across diverse cultural contexts. Each transition required Sarah to confront new aspects of her shadow patterns of thinking and behavior that had served her in previous situations but were now limiting her effectiveness. As her company grew, she had to deal with the shadow of her need for control, learning to delegate authority to others even when she could perform tasks more effectively herself. When expanding internationally, she had to confront the shadow of her cultural assumptions, acknowledging the limitations of her Western business perspectives. Jung's concept of the eternal return suggests that such ongoing transformation is not a sign of failure or instability but the natural consequence of continuous growth and development. Each cycle of death and rebirth occurs at a higher level of integration, incorporating the wisdom gained from previous cycles while opening new possibilities for expansion and service. Sarah discovered that her willingness to repeatedly destroy and rebuild aspects of herself had become her greatest asset as a leader. While her competitors struggled to adapt to changing market conditions and cultural contexts, her organization maintained the flexibility and innovation necessary to thrive in uncertain environments. Her employees and partners came to trust her ability to navigate complexity and uncertainty because they had witnessed her willingness to admit mistakes, learn from failures, and continuously evolve her approaches. This created a culture of psychological safety and continuous learning that attracted talented individuals who were themselves committed to growth and transformation. The ultimate invulnerability, the culmination of Jung's individuation process, is the development of what he called transcendent consciousness, awareness that encompasses both personal and transpersonal dimensions of existence. Individuals who achieve this level of development experience themselves as both unique individuals and expressions of universal principles that transcend individual existence. This transcendent consciousness provides the ultimate form of invulnerability described in the ancient wisdom that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This invulnerability comes not from being impervious to external influences but from being aligned with sources of strength and purpose that cannot be threatened by changing circumstances. Marcus Rivera, whose military leadership journey was described in Part 2, continued to apply these principles throughout a career that eventually led to positions of increasing responsibility and influence. His reputation for effectiveness in complex, uncertain situations resulted in assignments to some of the most challenging peacekeeping and conflict resolution missions in the world. In each new context, Marcus found that his success depended not on applying predetermined strategies but on accessing what Jung called the wisdom of the self, insights and capabilities that seemed to emerge from beyond his personal knowledge and experience. This wisdom often came through dreams, intuitive insights, or sudden understanding that arose during meditation or contemplation. Marcus learned to trust this deeper source of guidance even when its recommendations seemed to contradict conventional military wisdom. Time and again, he found that following these intuitive insights led to outcomes that were more effective and sustainable than approaches based solely on logical analysis and established procedures. His ability to access and trust this transpersonal source of wisdom allowed Marcus to remain calm and effective in situations that overwhelmed others. When facing complex political dynamics, cultural misunderstandings, or life-threatening crises, he could draw upon resources that went beyond his personal capabilities and training. This transcendent consciousness also provided Marcus with a form of emotional invulnerability that was qualitatively different from the defensive armor that most people develop. Rather than protecting himself from difficult emotions or challenging feedback, he learned to experience them fully while maintaining connection to the deeper center of his identity that remained unshaken by external circumstances. When missions failed, when colleagues criticized his methods, when superior officers questioned his decisions, Marcus could acknowledge these experiences without having his fundamental sense of worth or purpose threatened. His identity was rooted not in being right or successful in conventional terms but in serving purposes that transcended personal ambition or ego gratification. The legacy of transformation. Jung believed that individuals who complete the process of psychological individuation have a responsibility to help others navigate similar transformations. This responsibility arises naturally from their own experience rather than being imposed from outside. Having discovered the reality of psychological transformation for themselves, they become living examples of human potential that can inspire and guide others. Elena Vasquez, the neuroscience researcher whose consciousness studies were described in Part 2, eventually established an institute dedicated to investigating the practical applications of expanded models of consciousness. Her research had evolved beyond academic inquiry to include clinical applications, educational programs, and training for healthcare professionals who wanted to integrate consciousness-based approaches with conventional treatment methods. The institute became a gathering place for individuals from various fields who were exploring the implications of non-materialistic approaches to consciousness. Scientists, physicians, therapists, educators, and spiritual teachers collaborated on projects that would have been impossible within traditional institutional structures. Elena's personal transformation had created the foundation for a broader transformation in how consciousness is understood and investigated. Her willingness to destroy the weak self that needed approval from conventional academic authorities had enabled her to pioneer new approaches that were beginning to influence mainstream research and clinical practice. The Institute's work demonstrated that the principles Jung had discovered through individual psychological analysis could be applied at collective levels to transform institutions, communities, and cultural paradigms. Groups of individuals committed to authentic development could create organizational cultures that supported rather than hindered psychological growth and spiritual development. The indestructible legacy. The ultimate test of Jung's approach to psychological transformation is whether it produces individuals who can maintain their authentic center while effectively engaging with the challenges and complexities of ordinary life. The goal is not to withdraw from the world but to engage with it more skillfully and compassionately from a foundation of inner stability and wisdom. All of the individuals whose transformational journeys have been described in this exploration, Sarah the entrepreneur, Michael the surgeon, Lisa the marketing executive, Ahmed the psychiatrist, Elena the military officer turned consciousness researcher, Marcus the military leader, and Elena the neuroscientist, continued to face significant challenges throughout their careers. They dealt with business failures, health crises, relationship difficulties, financial pressures, and professional setbacks just like anyone else. What distinguished them was not the absence of difficulties but their response to challenges. Having learned to derive their fundamental sense of identity and worth from sources that transcend external circumstances, they could navigate setbacks without losing their center, face criticism without becoming defensive, and encounter uncertainty without becoming paralyzed. Their indestructibility came not from avoiding destruction but from having learned to transform destruction into reconstruction, problems into opportunities, and obstacles into stepping stones. They had discovered that the core of authentic selfhood, what Jung called the self, cannot be threatened by external forces because it is aligned with universal principles that transcend individual existence. This discovery allowed them to approach life with what Jung called a more fatty love of fate, the ability to embrace whatever circumstances arise as opportunities for learning, growth, and service. They no longer needed life to conform to their expectations or desires because they had found meaning and fulfillment in the process of growth itself rather than in specific outcomes or achievements. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has discovered the indestructible core of authentic being that exists within every human being but is accessed only by those willing to undertake the journey through psychological death and rebirth. This core provides the foundation for a kind of success that transcends personal achievement, the success of living authentically in service of purposes that ennoble rather than diminish human potential. Jung's greatest insight was recognizing that this transformation is available to anyone willing to undertake the necessary psychological work. It requires no special talents, credentials, or circumstances, only the courage to face oneself honestly and the persistence to continue growing despite the challenges that such growth inevitably brings. The extraordinary minds that succeed when others fail have simply accepted Jung's invitation to become who they actually are rather than remaining trapped in who they think they should be. In doing so, they discover that their true nature is far more resilient, creative, and powerful than the false selves they had been protecting. They learn that authenticity is the ultimate strength, vulnerability the deepest courage, and service the highest form of self-expression. This is the secret that ancient wisdom traditions have preserved and that Jung translated into psychological language for the modern world. The path to invulnerability runs through the complete acceptance of vulnerability. The way to ultimate strength requires the acknowledgement of fundamental weakness, and the journey to authentic power demands the surrender of all attempts to control outcomes that lie beyond our influence. The man who destroys his weak self discovers that what he thought he was protecting was actually what was limiting him, and what he thought would destroy him is actually what liberates him to become who he has always been in potential but never had the courage to become in reality.